Welcome back to another installment of Core Concepts Theology. So far, we've been learning about God himself.
We've covered things like reasons to believe God exists, the Trinity, and a flurry of characteristics like his love and justice and power.
But today, we're going to move from details of God's nature and character and instead focus on God's activities. So we're moving from who God is to what God does.
And we're going to break the activity of God into three big categories. Okay, creation, what he did; providence, what he always does; and miracles, what he sometimes does. And these aren't totally separate from who God is. We'll see that God's deeds, his actions, teach us more about who he is, and we watch his character shine as he acts.
Yeah, he's like Batman.
What?
You know, it's not who I am underneath, but what I do that defines me.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Good.
Let's start with creation. We're talking about all the way back in the beginning. This is what God did. Here's the big three to remember.
God created everything out of nothing. It was very good. It is all here to glorify him.
The fancy theological phrase here is that God created ex nihilo. That's just Latin for out of nothing. So when I say my daughter made a painting, we assume she took paint, paper, brushes that already existed and put them together in a new way to make art, right?
Yeah. But God doesn't reach into some pre-existing tool belt to make the universe. There was nothing except God.
Right.
Genesis 1:1 says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth and everything else out there."
The next big thing to remember with God's creation is that it was very good.
And we see this throughout the first chapter of Genesis. At the end of each day, God says that his creation is good. Everything was working as it should be.
Well, hang on, because the world isn't all that great, right? There's death and disease, famine, war. How is any of that good? Why would God create it this way?
Yeah, great question. And we'll get into this more in a later section in our Core Concept Theology course. But for now, here's the short answer. God created everything good, but it hasn't stayed that way. And that's because God has given us the ability to choose to obey him and do good, or disobey him and do evil. Humanity's choices to rebel against God have spread evil and brokenness throughout God's good creation. We've basically thrown a big wrench into God's universe.
Another thing to know about God's creation is that it is all here to glorify him.
Think of the awe you feel from the beauty of a sunrise or the vastness of an ocean. Revelation 4:11 says, "Worthy are you, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things." If God is the one who made all of this, then all glory is owed to him. All obedience is due to him, and our jaws should drop when we consider his incredible power and wisdom to create everything.
That's so good. Okay, so that's what God did, creation. But what does God do? Is he active today in the world, and how so?
Well, the short answer is that God is always intimately at work sustaining and governing his creation. And that might sound pretty basic, but it's not something that everyone believes. Theologians call this idea God's providence.
Whoa.
Did you hear that noise?
I heard something.
Yeah, that means it's time for our comparative religions moment.
Or what?
It's the time in our lesson where we talk about how Christianity stands out from other world religions and ways of thinking.
All right, lightning round for the 5 isms. All right, materialism, pantheism, dualism, deism, biblical creationism. Go.
Materialism says that the physical universe is all there is. No God, no creator, no supernatural. But we reject this idea. We saw in our first video that God exists. And we just learned today that God created everything out of nothing.
Pantheism says that the universe and God are one and the same. This is typically an Eastern way of thinking found in religions like Hinduism. When people talk about all things being divine or the universe was leading them to a certain path, that's pantheism. Again, the Bible has shown us that God created everything else. We celebrate his creation, but we don't worship it as divine.
Dualism says God and the universe are at war, that everything spiritual is good and anything physical, even our bodies, is bad. Dualism thinks our goal should be to rid ourselves of worldly things and transcend to the divine. Buddhism has some dualistic framework to it, as does an old sect of Judaism and Christianity called Gnosticism. But remember, we've also learned from the Bible that God created everything good. And we know the day is coming when God restores his creation in the last days.
So what about deism? Well, that one is going to carry us from God's activity in creation to God's activity in providence. Here, we ask the question, what God is up to in the universe now?
Deism sees God and the universe as separate, very separate. Not only is God not a part of the universe, he's basically left the building. Hands off, no intervention. Maybe he doesn't even care about this universe.
That brings us to this idea of providence. In broad strokes, not only did God create everything out of nothing very good for his glory, but God's providence is the idea that he is intimately involved in sustaining and governing it. So why do we believe that instead of the hands-off deism?
Well, listen to the way God's word speaks about his involvement in the daily aspects of the world. Job 12:10 tells us that in his hand is the life of every living thing. Hebrews 1:3 says that Jesus upholds the universe by the word of his power. God is intimately involved every moment in sustaining the universe, causing our lungs to fill with air, guiding the sun, moon, and stars.
Yeah, the Bible does not describe a God who is absent from his creation or doesn't care. And the best evidence of that, of all, is Jesus. The Son of God took on flesh to come live here with us, to love us and serve us, to die for us.
Yeah, so God's providence means that he is always at work to sustain his creation. But it's more than that. He's also governing it, leading it to accomplish his own plans in history. Romans 8:28 tells us that for those who love God, all things work together for good. So God is at work, guiding pieces of our lives, ruling the affairs of nations, and he's ensuring the ultimate good of his people. That's encouraging.
Does that mean God is controlling everything? Like scripting it out and we're basically just puppets acting out what he's already determined?
I don't think so. That's not how the Bible talks.
So in Deuteronomy 30, verse 19, God is urging his people to walk in obedience, find life in him. He says, I've set before you life and death, blessing and curse, therefore choose life.
Yeah, the God of the Bible gives us real choices, and he even cares about us. He wants us to find life in him.
Okay, so maybe he isn't pulling the strings like a puppeteer. Then what is he doing?
Well, God is so big and so awesome that he can work out his good plans for us in the midst of what we are up to. And the two best examples of this, I think, are Joseph and Jesus.
So in Genesis, we read about the tragic life of Joseph. He's bullied by his brothers, sold by them into slavery, and then goes from slavery to imprisonment. But from that prison, God uses Joseph to interpret Pharaoh's dream, to give Egypt the knowledge they need to survive a 7-year famine. And Joseph ends up saving his brothers' lives and all of God's people. Joseph says to his brothers, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good.
So even in the midst of the brokenness of the world, and even our own sinful decisions, God is at work bringing it all together to do good things that we could hardly imagine. I think it's time for our church father quote of the day.
Okay.
John Chrysostom, around 400 AD, described it this way, saying that Joseph and God's people were saved, quote, thanks to the creative God's wisdom, transforming all their wickedness into good.
What better example do we have of that than the cross of Christ?
Yeah. Human beings rejected and murdered God. We did it out of sinful and evil intent, but God was working out his good plan to save us all through it.
So friends, we want to make sure you hear this loud and clear. God is not the author of evil. He's not a fan of pain and suffering. He isn't pulling the strings and making bad people do bad things to you. But he is ruling over history, and he loves you and cares for you. And he's always at work to guide everything, even the suffering, to work out somehow for your good and his glory.
All right. So creation is what God did, and providence is what God does. Anything else?
Yeah. Miracles. What God does sometimes.
Miracles are a less common act of God that displays his glory as he acts in a supernatural way. And these supernatural and miraculous deeds are meant to leave us breathless at God's greatness. Exodus 15:11 says, "Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glorious deeds, doing wonders?"
Throughout the Bible, miracles don't seem to happen randomly.
Yeah.
God doesn't fire off miracles on a whim. The mighty works of God come along with really important events.
So when God is ready to make a people for himself from Abraham and Sarah, he works a wonder by opening the womb of a barren woman far past childbearing years.
Or when God is ready to move that same people from slavery to freedom, he does mighty deeds throughout Egypt and the 10 plagues and splitting the Red Sea.
Or when God establishes the church, he works many signs through the apostles. Those miracles basically shout, listen to these guys about Jesus.
Yeah.
Acts 2:22 says, "Men of Israel, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs which God did among you through him."
God seems to use miracles to prove his messengers right. So what does that mean? Do miracles not happen today since the apostles are done?
Well, there are some Christians who think so. This position is called cessationism. Miraculous signs have ceased. In 1 Corinthians 13, 8 through 10, Paul says that the more miraculous gifts, like prophecy and knowledge, will pass away when perfection comes. Cessationists say the New Testament has come, so the time of the miraculous is over.
But we'd argue that that passage is referring to heaven as perfection. We won't need prophecy in heaven because we can all just talk to God.
Yeah.
When it comes to miracles today, God is still able. But remember, God tends to work through his providential rule of the universe. We shouldn't expect miracles around every corner, but we can come to him with our needs, big or small, because God cares and is able.
Yeah.
Ephesians 3:20 says, he is able to do far more abundantly than all that we ask or think, according to the power at work within us.
The activity of God, creation, what he did, providence, what he does, miracles, what he does sometimes. And each of these actions of God shapes how we see him and ourselves.
Since God is creator, I belong to him.
Yeah.
That gives me value and purpose. And wow, he is amazing in power and wisdom and splendor and beauty. He is worthy of worship.
Since God is sustaining the universe, I can put my hope and trust in him. He will guide my life even when things look dark.
Since God can do miracles, I should pray. I should seek him to work, whether big or small, in my life. He is able. No problem is too big for him.
Yeah. If you'd like to dive into all of this more deeply, check out some of these resources.
So Jen Wilkin is the author of God of Creation, and that's available through Lifeway. Pastor Eric actually recommended that one.
Yeah. And then there's also a podcast by a guy named Preston Sprinkle, which is
the name.
A great name. His podcast is called Theology in the Raw. Tons of episodes, lots of different topics. He's really thoughtful, and he comes at things from multiple angles. Episode 807 is called How Old is the Earth? If you're interested in diving into the creation, old Earth, young Earth debate, he's got a really thoughtful approach to some of those things. Hey, Pastor Mark here. I realized after looking at that podcast, it leans in the direction of old Earth. So I want to give you another option where you can hear young Earth and old Earth being debated. So check out the Unbelievable podcast, episode 147, Do We Live on a Young or an Old Earth?
That's all we've got for you in this lesson. We'll see you next time.